I'm very happy to welcome you to the second of this semester's lectures that are part of the MA program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Today we have the pleasure of engaging Dr. Paul Lyons, and on November the 8th, 2007, same time, same place, that is here in F226, we shall have Dr. Michael Hayes with us, who will speak to us on the topic, Carcasses of Memory, Ruins as Memorials to Wartime Destruction and Persecution in Germany. I hope you also will join us for that presentation and for another presentation later in the month of November, November 29th, when we will have Dr. Paul Moises, who will speak to us about Balkans, the land of genocides. Dr. Paul Lyons is a member of the faculty teaching in the MA program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He has been teaching about social movements, racism, and diversity for 4 decades. He has published an essay about his approach to teaching about the Holocaust. I don't know what he's going to say this afternoon, but allow me, if you will, to quote Dr. Dalia Ofer, who will be our spring 2008 Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust. The task of the university teacher, she says, when teaching about the Holocaust is twofold. The teacher of the Holocaust must help young adults to accumulate knowledge and insight about a short but very complex period, integrating an understanding of the crises of democracy with the racial ideology and anti-Semitism that accompanied the rise of Nazism. The other task is to foster in the students a sense that despite the ugliness, cruelty, and desperation experienced in the Holocaust, it is important to struggle with issues raised by it. Another task is to help students to ask the educational questions and use pedagogy to convey meaningful conclusions about the Holocaust, and to move students to act and be responsible for their own society, and to promote tolerance and human rights. Those of us who teach about the Holocaust or about other genocides should not only teach about facts and figures, or about historical context and recent or age-old ethnic, religious, or national conflicts, important as that may well be. What we must do, I would suggest, is raise ethical questions, explore the human capacity for selfishness, as well as the human capacity for compassion. In teaching about the Holocaust, whether it is the genocide of the Jews during World War II or another genocide, it is imperative that we raise questions of a more personal nature, such as, for example, the human capacity to resist evil. In doing so, we should help students to confront some of the most difficult questions any of us can confront. How do human beings, people presumably raised to distinguish right from wrong, people with families of their own, people who say they love their parents, spouses, children, friends, and relatives, how do such ordinary people come to participate in the vicious slaughter of powerless men, women, and children? Why does the teaching of good and evil in organized societal and religious institutions fail to prevent genocide? Why do the structures of civil society, education, law, religion, diplomacy not stop such evil? Where does moral and religious education flounder? Why do moral and religious education fail to create more resistance to evil and not encourage more doing of good? What kind of teaching, what kind of education can help students to grapple with these kinds of questions? What kind of teaching, What kind of education can prepare people in a democratic society to do more than simply know about genocide, but if and when faced with genocide, empower people to act to stop genocide? As I said at the beginning, I do not know what Professor Paul Lyons will say to us this afternoon, but whatever it is, I hope that his presentation, Teaching the Holocaust and Genocide, Uniqueness and Transferability, will help us to grapple with some of the questions I've raised. Dr. Lyons?
Hi, everybody. I know a lot of you, which is nice. Let me turn on my mic. Everybody hear me decently? Okay. Oh, this looks like it's getting in the way over there. Bob, we're okay? We're good. Okay. I don't know if I can live up to Carol's comments. This was actually hard for me. I had something I thought I was prepared to do as of Sunday, and I had one of those moments where I tore it in pieces and decided to go back and reconfigure what I was going to say. And I'm usually very neat and everything all written out and what have you. And this is all over the map. I think it's going to be hopefully interesting and challenging to you, but in some ways in my head it's almost still a work in progress. And as you hear me speak about it, I think you'll hear that it's necessarily, in many ways, a work in progress. Let me start by explaining what I mean by transferability and how it connects to the issue of uniqueness. My own perspective is that isolating historical injustices experienced by a particular group, Jews, African Americans, Africans, gays and lesbians, any group, risks playing into what some people have called a hierarchy of victimhood, a form of identity politics in which one's own suffering counts, and only one's own suffering counts. Too often, educational institutions create group-oriented study programs like Jewish studies, African American studies, women's studies, gay and lesbian studies, in which students fixate on a particular group without stretching their imagination and their ethical concerns to include the broader range of those who have been mistreated. Instead, I want students to begin with the axiom that all people, no exception, have histories which include glory and shame, and that all peoples have the capacity to regress toward intolerance, toward ethnocentricity, toward discrimination, toward bigotry. Now, the best story I can give to illuminate this is a wonderful story I discovered and that I used in my Holocaust class on a number of occasions. It's by a Native American whose name is Robert Allen Warrior, and it's an essay called Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians, Deliverance, Conquest, and Liberation Theology Today. It's in a very interesting volume called Voices of the Religious Left that Temple University put out a number of years ago. And this really blew me away, actually, when I first encountered it. So I want to read Warrior and give you a sense of how he's thinking. He says, I believe that the story of the Exodus is an inappropriate way for Native Americans to think about liberation. No doubt the story is one that has inspired people in many contexts to struggle against injustice. Israel in the exile, then diaspora, would remember the story and be reminded of God's faithlessness. African Americans, given Bibles to read by their masters and mistresses, would begin at the beginning of the book and find in the pages of the Bible a God who was obviously on their side, even if that God was the God of their oppressors. People in Latin America, Latin American-based communities, read the story and have been inspired to struggle against injustice. The Exodus, with its picture of a God who takes the side of the oppressed and the powerless, has been a beacon of hope for many. And yet, the liberationist picture of Yahweh is not complete. A delivered people is not a free people, nor is it a nation. People who have survived the nightmare of subjugation dream of escape. Once the victims have been delivered, they seek a new dream, a new goal, usually a place of safety, away from their oppressors, a place that can be defended against future subjugation. Israel's new dream became the land of Canaan, and Yahweh was still with them. Yahweh promised to go before the people and give them Canaan with its flowing milk and honey. The land, Yahweh decided, belonged to these former slaves from Egypt, and Yahweh planned on giving it to them, using the same power used against the enslaving Egyptians to defeat the indigenous inhabitants of Canaan. Yahweh the deliverer became Yahweh the conqueror. The obvious characters in the story for Native Americans to identify with are the Canaanites. And when I read that for the first time, it totally blew me away, because I'm a child of the 1960s, of the Civil Rights Revolution. I can't tell you how many moments I spent in black churches listening to preachers, almost indistinguishable except in degree of eloquence from Martin Luther King Jr., use all the metaphors that moved all of us. We too will get to the promised land. And after all, King was self-consciously the Moses figure in that last sermon he gives in Memphis the night before he's assassinated. He says, and we too shall get to the promised land. I may not get there with you, almost daring a Mosaic comparison. And it's impossible not to resonate either within the Jewish tradition that I'm born into or the political tradition that I joined, not to be moved by the notion of crossing the River Jordan and the entire Exodus story. And yet, when Robert Warrior tells me he identifies with the Canaanites, one has to stop and pause, because in all stories there are these moral dilemmas. And when he says, he sees the world within the eyes of the Canaanites, that makes me stop and pause. And that's the first story that I really wanted to think about. I can relate that to the experience I had in Vietnam. I went there as a scholar, not as a soldier. And I went there as an anti-war activist in awe of the Vietnamese for their endurance and their resilience in the face of our firepower. And I think, like many people who were involved in the peace movement, I tended to romanticize them. But one of the things I learned when I was there with a group of scholars talking to Vietnamese scholars in the 80s, was that they had a similar history. The Vietnamese began in the Red River Valley in the northern parts of North Vietnam, and they migrated southward as their population increased. As they migrated southward, they pushed out, annihilated, killed, subjugated indigenous populations, a story that seems to be almost a constant in world history, and part of the subtext of what I'm talking about. And I realized that they too shared a history of glory and shame. They too shared a history in which there were heroic moments in which they were the underdog, they were the David. But in another, just shifting over a little bit, looking at it from a slightly different angle, they too were the Goliath, and the people who, during those years, the French called the Montagnards, or the mountain people, were the survivors of that story. They had moved up into the mountains because that was the only way they could manage in the face of superior force. Now, a third story involves a former student of mine who I just missed in town this weekend. Most of you, I don't think any of you, maybe Marianne might know him, the only person who might know him. His name is Jose Guadalupe, and he was a student of mine about 20 years ago. Jose was a Puerto Rican who came to the United States as a teen, barely, I think, not speaking English. He was not literate in English. Came into Atlantic City, arrived at Stockton, coming out of into our EOF program in the summer. By the time Jose graduated Stockton, he was my tutor when I was teaching freshmen in the basic skills program. He grew that rapidly. And he went on to get an MSW in social work at University of South Carolina, and a PhD, MSW at Rutgers, and a PhD at University of South Carolina. and he is presently an associate professor of social work at Cal State Sacramento, and wrote a book where he actually asked me to do the preface, which was a wonderful experience for me to be able to do that. But Jose's an interesting guy. He was my son's favorite babysitter. My son still remembers Jose. Whenever we had a party, I would invite Jose, and he would bring his guitar and entertain the 4-year-olds or the 3-year-olds or the 6-year-olds. Charismatic, beautiful human being. And he very interested in Eastern religions. And about 5 years ago, he told me that he had changed his name, which is very hard for me. I still have a hard time not calling him Jose. He changed his name to Krishna. His name is Krishna Guadalupe. And what he told me was how much trouble this created for him in the Latino community to which he was devoted. This is a guy who through his entire adult life has been an activist in multiculturalism, and particularly in making the argument for the dignity and the rights of people of Latino descent. But what he found was a suspiciousness, a notion that he was selling out, a notion that he was a self-hating Latino, if I can borrow a phrase from other communities. And it actually gave him a wiser and broader view of what multiculturalism meant. And part of the issue that I'm interested in is the way in which one's vision can be narrowed by forms of ethnic identity. One can be put into a box and not allowed to step out of it. You know, to use the stereotypical language, a black kid who doesn't like basketball, a black kid who loves Chopin, you know, a Jewish kid who isn't a great student, an Asian kid who isn't a great student. I mean, all the stereotypical things that we tend to box people into. The last story is more pointed. The last story a friend of mine told me. He was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I've been there several times, a most moving experience. I'm sure almost many of you have been there and had that experience. You walk out and you want to be in that room where you can just commune with yourself for a little while, decompress. You don't want to go outside right away. It's too hard. It's too much. He does that. He leaves the building, and there's two or three couples chatting. And they're chatting about how moving the experience is, but they're also talking about getting dinner. And in their conversation about getting dinner, they're all Jewish, by the way, they're talking about where to go for dinner. And one person mentioned a particular restaurant, and another responded that it was in a bad neighborhood and used what I would call the Yiddish N-word, Schwarze. And I thought, when my friend told me the story, how is it that the knowledge, the deep, penetrating knowledge of the Holocaust Museum, the study of the Holocaust, Holocaust education, didn't transfer? That's what I mean by transferability. Didn't transfer to other forms of bigotry. And that's an essential theme that I'm raising. Now let me say at this point that I do not share Peter Novick's questioning of the value of the Holocaust Museum. I think he takes his argument much too far in a book I use in my class, The Holocaust and American Life. But I do share with this very noted historian a concern with a variety of other questions regarding the value of teaching about the Holocaust. I would add, we here at Stockton, and this particularly for those of you who are here in attendance on Sunday for the 10th anniversary celebration of this program's history, honoring Doug Servey and Steve Marcus, who's right out there, I think we'll understand that we do a better job in this regard than many others. I mean, it's thrilling to hear Steve and Doug get up there and talk about Darfur and talk about Nanjing and talk about the ways in which their integration of a Holocaust and Genocide program has stretched them in those kinds of ways. But the question I have, is that typical here? And is that typical in the Holocaust educational community at large? And honestly, my answer is no. My answer is no. Now, indeed, the raising of these issues, which now necessarily include, for example, the controversy over the new book by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy. Those issues, it seems to me, are producing much more heat than light. And it's not as if, quote unquote, the other side on these issues. For example, those people who are deeply partisan in favor of Palestinian rights, for example, and very critical of Israel, are any more open-minded or tolerant than those who are partisan for a particular version of Israeli policy. In fact, I would say whichever group dominates in a college environment tends to deny the other group legitimacy. If there's a campus somewhere where a third world kind of perspective that thinks the Palestinian issue is the top of the moral agenda of the world dominates, they will prevent a person from speaking or being hired or promoted who takes a position that's empathetic or sympathetic or in line with that of official Israeli policy or anything close to that. And at the same time, if there's anybody who speaks in a way that is in any substantive way critical of what has been Israeli policy and Israeli history vis-a-vis the Palestinians, there will be people in the organized Jewish community and their allies, including the Holocaust educational community, who will turn their back on academic freedom and demand that the person not be hired, the person not be promoted, and so on and so forth. And that bothers me a great deal. The most recent case we have in this regard is Desmond Tutu, a Nobel Peace Prize winner who was recently denied a lecture at St. Thomas Catholic College in Minneapolis on the allegation that he's anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And not only was Desmond Tutu denied speaking at St. Thomas, the College of St. Thomas, but the director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at that college had lost his directorship of the program on the basis of the protests, the successful protests of Tutu speaking on that college campus. We have the case of Norman Finkelstein, a scholar in the Chicago area, whose tenure has been put into question from protests mostly coming from Alan Dershowitz. We have the case of Tony Jute, one of our most distinguished scholars at New York University, a political scientist, who was supposed to speak at the Polish consulate in New York City. The speech was canceled because there were protests because the argument was that he was anti-Israel. Tony Jute, by the way, is Jewish, and by any stretch of my definition, is anything but anti-Israel. So we have a number of instances like that. Now, at the same time, and this is why this is difficult, one can play down the genuinely scary revival of anti-Semitism, which seems to be happening certainly in the Middle East, in the Arab and Muslim communities, and perhaps even more tellingly in the European community. I have to tell you just that the behavior of British academics in boycotting Israeli academics, to me, is just shameful and selective, utterly selective, and cowardly. I don't know how else to describe it. So what I'm trying to communicate is the problem crosses many boundaries. And I'm deeply concerned about the loss of discourse that results from what seems to me to be two very well-organized bodies, neither of which wants to talk to the other, neither of which wants to give legitimacy to the other side. I am very worried that too often those who defend the state of Israel use the charge of anti-Semitism to silence critics. The case of Jimmy Carter is an obvious case in point in his intentionally provocative book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. The case of Mearsheimer and Walt, the case of Tony Jute. So I think what we need to be thinking about is how does Holocaust education address these matters? Does it? Should it? Is it complicit in these threats to free speech and liberty? Is it merely silent, and is that a form of complicity? It's very difficult to be self-critical and to subject one's own family. You know, if somebody, my dad gets in trouble and somebody says, your dad's a bum, I'm going to punch out his lights. Because the first value in that regard is not truth, it's loyalty. it's really love. Love trumps something middle-class people don't usually understand. Working-class people understand it very well. If you're not loyal, you're nothing. If you're not loyal, you are nothing. But as a general principle, that's high risk. That puts you into a number of moral dilemmas, particularly if your dad is Tony Soprano or something along those lines. Whether it's one's family, one's tribe, one's religion, one's nation, one's race. It's difficult to apply the same standards we ask others to apply. Think of the exemplary behavior of Henry Louis Gates, the African-American scholar, who several years ago was vilified in the black community for participating in the creation of a TV series on Africa that openly talked about African complicity in the slave trade and in slavery. He was vilified. Washing one's dirty laundry in public in front of the other is deeply and consistently resisted. And this is especially the case, and even understandably the case, if the group who's worried about its dirty linen has been historically oppressed, has been bruised, has good reason to stretch the term paranoid. Because paranoia, often there are real enemies. Okay? And you don't want to put that in the hands of other people. That's the issue. And that's the issue that Jews has historically oppressed people, and Italians, and Catholics, and we can go on and on in terms of the groups. Okay. Unfortunately, when you refuse to wash your dirty linen in public, when you act protectively, you become corrupted, because it signals to your group that they're not held accountable. That they're not held accountable. I can tell you from my experience as a lefty, as a longtime 60s SDS, neo-Marxist revolutionary, and somebody who wrote his first book on the Communist Party, that one of the most corrupting things on the left, including the Communist Party at the outset, is precisely this issue. Keep it inside. Don't let the others know about it. Nothing corrupts you worse than keeping silent on a truth. I hold very seriously to the viewpoint that the truth, if there's anything that's revolutionary, it's the truth. It may be the only thing that's revolutionary. So that what Gates was trying to do was recognizing the inherently complex, overdetermined dimensions of human behavior, the essentially tragic nature of all of our histories. And to me, it's kind of analogous to what we all as children grow up doing with our parents. In many ways, this may be my Freudian training coming into play, but I think the analogy holds. When we're real little, our parents are gods. First of all, they're gigantic. I mean, you all remember, still in my mind, I try to remember what it was like when I wanted my feet to reach the ground when I sat in a chair, and when everybody was there. And I always had to look up to whoever it was. And somewhere, depending on who you are and what situation you go through, usually teenage years, you discover your parents are not gods. In fact, you discover that they're worse than gods. They're total bums. They're insensitive louts. They don't understand you at all. They're ignorant. They're irrational. Right down the line. Now, there's some people who stay in that status for the rest of their life. And I would say, generally speaking, the people who stay in that situation never grow up. They never grow up. Because they never recognize that viewing their parents as gods or viewing their parents as devils is the same thing. It's not a nuanced, complicated, mature response. And those of us who are lucky enough to grow up and get past that come to embrace our parents with the full knowledge of their frailties. If you have brothers and sisters, all those reunions, both when they're alive and then even more when they've passed, my parents have passed, or those chuckling moments when I turn to my sister and we just remember some inanity or some moment, some clash we had, and we've absorbed it because we have accepted the humanness, that our parents did the best they could. They were frail. They were not perfect. I think it's analogous to what we need to do with our larger identities. We in the United States, I think, suffer from this terribly. We're the greatest country in the world. You got to wear a flag on your lapel. God forbid Barack Obama doesn't have a flag on his lapel when people are ready to, to string him up. And yet when people move away from that, when they discover that maybe Vietnam's not a good war, or maybe we're racist, or all the other kind of stuff that people like I discovered in the 60s, you flip over to the other side, and all of a sudden America's the worst country in the history of the world, and it's evil, and nothing it does is any good. It's the same process. It's adolescent, it's understandable, but it doesn't solve anything. Now, let me add another dimension to the problem we face, and it relates to the issue of uniqueness. Peter Novick raises it in his book, and there's two dimensions to it, I think, from Novick. The first dimension is, what do you mean when you say something's unique? Of course it's unique. Almost all historical events are unique. The issue is whether that means it's not comparable. Or, equally, as the philosopher Beryl Lang puts it in very direct ways, so what if it's unique? Where do we go from there once we say it's unique? And I think Novick is correct to charge, and I want to read his way of putting it, if I can. That would be probably a good idea. Let's see if I can find it. Maybe I won't. That's okay if I don't. Actually, I think I have it in here. So be patient. This is the example of me getting this preparation together in the last 2 days. Let me save on that. What Novick says is that is the claim of uniqueness anything more than a claim of greater suffering, a playing into what we see, unfortunately, in other bruised people? Our suffering is greater than yours. That's what uniqueness comes down to. We've suffered more than you have. Is that finally what it means? As Novick concludes, does anybody really believe that the claim of uniqueness is anything other than a claim for preeminence? Okay. Now, the other aspect of uniqueness that Novick raises has to do with moral challenge. Now, here Novick suggests that it's relatively easy for Americans to embrace Holocaust education and Holocaust awareness because it makes few demands on them within this particular environment. Basically he asks, how hard is it for Americans to affirm the horrors of the Holocaust? To quote him, for most Americans, deploring the Holocaust is a rather ritualistic, albeit undoubtedly well-meant gesture toward the Jews who asked them to do so, a cost-free avowal that as decent people they are moved by the murder of the Jews. The memory of the Holocaust is so banal, so inconsequential, no memory at all, precisely because it is so uncontroversial, so unrelated to real divisions in American society, so apolitical. And in that sense, I think what he raises, and I raise, and this is where I agree with him totally, that it's less demanding on an individual than coming to grips with the legacy of slavery and racism, than the legacy of Native American genocide. Those are issues that force Americans to consider issues of remedy, consider issues of your responsibility, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's wars on poverty, whether it's taxes to pay for wars on poverty and other kinds of efforts to remediate and repair, whether it's issues of reparations, not to speak of what it means in one's own community, about issues of driving while black or real estate racism. I mean, every community that we live in, particularly the middle-class white communities, this happens regularly. Black folks will tell you, my black colleagues will tell you regularly that, you know, if there's a get-together or a conversation and it's going to be in Margate and it's at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night, they're nervous in a way I'm not nervous. Because they think there's a reasonable possibility or probability that a cop's going to stop them and ask, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Okay. These are real things. These are real things. I can tell you from having been married for many years to a woman who taught 18 years in Pleasantville that I can't tell you how many social events I went to where we would engage in the classic conversation with people you don't know. Where are you from? What do you do? Where do you work? And when my wife would say, I'm a teacher, where do you teach? I teach in Pleasantville. I always wanted a camera or to take those shots. Usually she got looks of sympathy, oh, you poor dear, or a roll of the eyes, or something that wasn't said, but it was obvious and was apparent. Okay. Now, I don't want to ride that horse too extensively. Actually, I think on the issue of racism, there's been a lot of progress. It's not all bleak. By no means do I want to go in that direction. There's demagogy. There's the ubiquitous Al Sharpton, who seems to show up anywhere and everywhere where there's an issue pertaining to race, as long as he can get his face on a camera. There's the Duke case, which I use in class because it's a wonderful example of how our predisposition to believe something needs to be held a little bit more skeptically until the evidence comes in. It's a very good lesson when I teach ethnic-minority relations. Okay, you think this is true. You want this to be true. Is it true? How do you know it's true, other than your gut feeling that it's true? Okay, and we live in an environment where we can't make assumptions. We can't make the assumption that just because it's black, it's right. Just because a black person says it, it's true. Any more than we can make the assumption that just because a Jew says something, that it's true. Or a woman or a gay person. Part of respecting that person is subjecting them to the same criteria you subject anybody else to. That's the only way you really respect a person. If I can be French, so we have students here, that's okay. Very important to tell people they're full of shit when they're full of shit. It's the only way you can show respect. That's just literally the case. So the question is, do we do enough to address the story of those couples leaving the Holocaust Museum? And are we confident that our study of the Holocaust transfers to other directly experienced oppressions, that our sense of the uniqueness of the Holocaust doesn't, at least at times, play into the kind of moral one-upsmanship which inevitably denigrates the suffering of others, perhaps most particularly those whose situations require us to take some risks. And all of this tends to make me very nervous. So please don't think of this as intentionally provocative, as this provocation as binary, in which it's an either or. I don't think that's true. Or as a denunciation or repudiation for all that we do, which it's decidedly not. I deeply believe in the value of Holocaust and genocide education, as I believe in the value of women's studies and Africana studies and on and on. And I think Novak is actually wrong to suggest that Holocaust studies are irrelevant to Americans, because Americans are Westerners. And we're part of a nation of Christians. If I can chastise John McCain for a moment, we're part of a nation of Christians, not a Christian nation. And as a nation built on Christian foundations, and as a nation that's part of the West, we do bear responsibility. We do need to know about the Holocaust. It is part of our experience. And I think Novak pushes that argument further than I would. But I would say that I get very nervous when Holocaust-related events are plugged into one-sided views of Israeli politics. And I've been in those situations myself on a number of occasions. I know from talking to people who have been on what I think are basically extraordinary tours of sites in Eastern Europe, that there is almost inevitably a selling of policy. And I think that's a problem. I think it's a moral problem within Holocaust education. I don't know how to solve it. My only way to solve it is to open it up so we talk about it. I don't think we talk about it. I mean, if I can challenge you in the broadest sense, I don't think there's been an honest discussion about Palestinian rights on this campus since I've been here. The closest we came was last year when I brought a theater troupe here of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, who engaged in the issue on stage. And it was wonderful that it went through and there was no protest. And it was successful. But I can't think of another instance where that happened. The closest case I have, which to me was depressing, was a number of years ago. There was a student organization that attempted to organize a pro-Palestinian meeting or rally, and they put up posters on the kiosks. And the posters, I thought, were ill-advised. They did what often happens in those situations. They compared Israel to Nazi Germany and did things I thought were stupid, foolish, insensitive. But the solution to that was to talk to them and to engage with them and to allow them to voice their view. That didn't happen. Instead, there was kind of a huggy-kissy, we are the world, we're part of the rainbow, and nobody said anything about Palestinians, which avoided the issue completely. One of my colleagues wrote an article about that to me was just dreadful, and I've told her that. We have never engaged in that issue, and I think we don't engage in it because we're uncomfortable with engaging in the issue. We're afraid of dealing with the Canaanites. Okay, now, there are upsides. There are models for us. There are examples for us. The best example, honestly, is our own dear friend Dan Barone, who has spent his entire life, his latter life, just had a birthday, right? Trying to address the issue of the other, trying to construct public school textbooks that tell the story of Jews and tell the story of Palestinians and give them each legitimacy, and trying to sell that within the Israeli schools to try to bring people together, as he brought together Protestants and Catholics and whites and blacks in South Africa and the descendants of Nazi perpetrators with the descendants of those victimized by the Holocaust. I mean, that it seems to me as a model for what we need to do. Another model for what we need to do is the wonderful African-American playwright and writer Anna Deavere Smith. Some of you, if you had my class, I showed some of her stuff. I'm not sure how much you know about her. She's now a theater professor. Last at Stanford, I'm not sure if she's still there. She did these were originally one-act plays. She did them on Broadway. First was called Fires in the Mirror, and it dealt with Crown Heights riots in New York City and Brooklyn that probably led to Rudy Giuliani being elected mayor, among other things. And she also did another one called Twilight Los Angeles, which was about the Los Angeles riots a little bit later in 1992. And let me just read to you a little bit off of that. In Fires in the Mirror, her one-person show about Crown Heights clashes between Hasidic Jews and African Americans, Smith listened to, taped, and then performed multiple voices, maybe 30, from Al Sharpton to the Lubavitcher Hasids, from housewives to street toughs, young, old, black, Jewish, rich, poor, the enraged and the saddened. She offered no solutions, only questions within a framework of empathy and a sense of our responsibility, individual and collective, to bridge the kinds of differences which can yield such insularities, hatreds, and indeed crimes. Gates, who I talked about earlier, and Smith stand as African Americans boldly stating that their people are strong enough, mature enough, and proud enough to present the fullness of their historical legacy. And just as almost sounds like a trivial aside, but the movie Barbershop is another wonderful example of that, because it's a point where black people say we can do our dirty linen in public. We can kid about ourselves. It was a big to-do. Jesse Jackson criticized them because they made fun of Martin Luther King. Well, come on. It is time to make fun of Martin Luther King, just as Mel Brooks embodies the confidence in the Jewish community to make fun of the Nazis. And Mel Brooks is very specific about that. He's a very intently, deadly serious man who served in World War II and has the most ferocious view of anti-Semitism and of fascism. But his view is very clear. the best way to defang something is to ridicule it, is to make fun of it. And it takes a confident people to be able to do that. So let me end with what I consider exemplary in maximizing transferability and ensuring that our sense of uniqueness is not used as an instrument of smug self-satisfaction and blindness to the just claims of others. We are appropriately a Holocaust and Genocide program. At our best, we balance uniqueness with what is shared in the human condition. We work very, very hard in the master's program, in the Holocaust Resource Center, in Jewish Studies, and in all the other ethnic, religious, and gendered study groups on campus, most of which I admire, to ensure transferability, to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust or of any other injustice don't reinforce insularity. In some ways, we all need to embrace both the story of the Exodus, the notion of a promised land, without making the Canaanites invisible. Without making the Canaanites invisible. Michael Lerner, who I actually went to high school with, who is a fairly controversial figure, he's the publisher of Tikkun, argues in the metaphor that I think makes the most sense, that what happened was the Jews of Europe were in a burning building, and they went to the roof of the burning building, and there was nothing else they could do but jump off the burning building. Otherwise, they were gone. And when they jumped off the building, they landed on another group of people called Palestinians. Who's to blame? Anybody to blame? Okay, and I think that's a useful metaphor to keep in mind when we try to make sense of what is very hard to make sense. We need to ensure that our work both makes for a world with fewer victims and one in which we help victims recognize their own capacity to become victimizers. And that's it, so thank you.
You have some time to engage Professor Lyons in questions, agreements, disagreements, so open
You're on.
the floor.
I wanted to provoke you, so I hope I did, but don't be shy. Michael.
I'll jump right in. And I don't feel so much provoked as in agreement with much of what you've said.
Okay.
But I find it interesting because on the one subject of Holocaust studies here in the United States, the Novick, right, I sort of have your take, I agree with your take on that 100%, that he was off the deep end in many regards, but he made some really interesting and valid points along the way. That there's this nexus of sort of a historical nexus that takes place in the United States, I think, in the post-World War II decades, that we had fought the good war, World War II, for reasons that are very different than the reasons we use to justify it in many ways today.
Sure.
That is, in 1945, the suffering of the Jews wasn't the reason to get into the war, it wasn't the reason that we fought the war and saw it to a conclusion, but it does help to justify this view, which I agree with, that it is the good war, right? And it's largely for this reason that we find it possible to create a Holocaust Museum in Washington and really centralize that issue and that suffering as one that's very important before we deal in any kind of similar way with the African American experience of slavery and the various victimizations that occurred along the way of making the modern United States.
But Novick also, one of the main lines in his story is the timing of it. I mean, Novick is very much influenced by Tom Segev, the Israeli journalist, in several of his books. One of Segev's books, if you haven't read him, which I think is called The Seventh Million, is an account of how the DPs, the survivors of the Holocaust, Jews who were in displacement camps in Europe, were regarded by the Sabras in Israel. Well, not even the Sabras necessarily, but the Israelis, the Zionists. And there's some extraordinary quotations. For example, Ben-Gurion, who at one point said, you know, all the good Jews died. The only ones who lived were the scoundrels. You can only survive if you were a scoundrel. And that was perhaps an exaggerated take, but it was a piece of the take of how the Zionists were viewing those who, from their view, had refused to leave Europe, you know, hadn't understood back in the 20s that they had to build a new country, had been fooled into the notion that they could become part of Germany or part of France or part of any other society, who were weak, who were inferior. And Dan, in fact, Dan's initial research was about the issue of wartime behavior and what we would call today PTSD, in which, if I remember correctly, there was one particular battle in the '48 War for Independence where the troops didn't fight as valiantly as legend has it, and the Israeli establishment basically said that's because they were DPs. You know, they're not real Israelis. Real Israelis fight. You know, the DPs run. You know, like they go off to the ovens. You know, that kind of notion. So we had a comparable pattern, though I think Novick exaggerates it a bit. I think there was ambivalence about the Holocaust in American Jewish culture in the 40s and the 50s. And I think his storyline is relatively true, but I think it needs some revision because, you know, I'm born in 1942. I'm growing up in a virtually all Jewish Weequahic section in Newark, New Jersey, Philip Roth's neighborhood. In fact, Philip Roth writes about this. You know, he writes about the embarrassment. One of the stories he writes about the embarrassment of there being Hasids in the neighborhood. And I can remember that as a kid. Hasids embarrassed me. I was Jewish. I was American. They weren't. They couldn't be Jewish. They wore the hats and the payas and the coats. And I didn't want any of my friends to think that they were me at that point. And he captured that piece of it. Except on the other hand, I remember obsessing on, we didn't call it the Holocaust then. It was just the war and the killing of 6 million. That language didn't really happen until the 60s. But as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old, when TV happened in my house in 1951, just in time for Bobby Thompson's home run to beat the Dodgers. And that was the first TV I ever watched. But I obsessed with all the documentary shows. Victory at Sea. There were these series that would be on TV in the 50s with Richard Rodgers music soaring. And I watched every single one of them. I was not an academic kid at that time. I was a jock. But I knew that my parents were just this close to have been murdered. And I knew that I needed to know more about that. I know that's why I became a historian. It's absolutely why I became a historian. You know, when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, how did this happen? You know, why are my parents here? There was a guy named Joe Greenberg who was a grocer in the store where my father worked. My father was in the grocery business, had a number. The first guy I ever knew who had a number. Wonderfully kind, meek, quiet guy, gentleman. And that always stayed in mind. I can remember first seeing it, first talking about it, asking about it. So I don't think people avoided it, but I think there was some ambivalence. Carol?
A comment, well, two comments. One, I thought it was interesting that you specifically talked about Dan Barone's program, and
Sure.
you didn't mention Sami Adwan.
Yeah.
Probably
Absolutely
takes more of a risk.
Yeah.
And Dan is
Absolutely.
Israeli and Sami is Palestinian. No.
Put myself
So
aside.
I think that's a very interesting
No,
Freudian
you're absolutely right.
Second comment I would make is that, first of all, I like a lot of what you said as well, and this issue of transferability, in my view, also has to do with ethical and moral questions. I mean, when
Absolutely.
one asks these kinds of deep ethical and moral questions, you cannot help but also ask it about other events. So I would say that. But I would like to point out to you that from its very beginnings, the United States Holocaust Memorial Council in Washington, which is the precursor to the museum, always had as a part of its program, from the 78 report of Wiesel to President Carter, the Committee on Conscience. And it has always had the Committee on Conscience, which was to deal with other genocide. So, who drew attention to Darfur? Hey, it wasn't the black community in this country. It was the Jews in this country. It was the museum in Washington, which had its the online exhibition, the exhibition. Who drew attention to Chechnya? Yeah, it wasn't the Catholics who drew attention to Chechnya. It was the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. that has called it a genocide, a watch on Chechnya. I mean, who has drawn attention to Rwanda? Do you think it was the Roman Catholic Church? No, it wasn't the Roman Catholic Church. The museum in Washington, D.C. I only say that because I think that even in your presentation, that you push the question a bit too far. I mean, you end up with this quotation about who jumped on the Palestinians, which I think is a little gratuitous as an ending comment. I mean, I think it's
They
far
weren't to
more-
blame for jumping.
No,
They didn't intend to jump on the Palestinians.
I know, but it
They were
makes
fleeing
it
a
sound
burning
like,
building.
hey, those poor defenseless people. It isn't the Palestinian. First of all, I'm extremely empathetic to the notion of a two-state solution. But I mean, it's the Israeli left wing that, and not even the left wing, that is calling attention to the Palestinians. It's not the Palestinians calling attention to the Holocaust and to what happened to the Jews. You know, so I mean, I think you raise very interesting questions, but if I might
Go ahead.
be a bit bold,
Be bold.
I think that you have. I think
Slap
that
me
you
around.
have-
I'm not going to hit a nun. Come on.
And I'm not an
Yeah.
uncritical supporter of Israel, as you know. And when I take folks to Israel, I mean, they see the works of Israel, and I let them do it because they say, listen, Israel, despite the fact there's a lot I don't like about their government policy, I mean, they are a democracy. You can fight with them, and you know all the rest of it. And I mean, and even I wasn't aware about Tutu, but even the Finkelstein issue at DePaul University, another Catholic university, if I might say, is.
And we expect more than Catholics.
Whatever, but I mean, I think it's more complicated than the lines. that
Okay.
you draw.
Okay. I feel somewhat like when people ask questions about why I'm critical of Iraq or why I was critical of Vietnam. I consider myself a deep lover of this country. I have many, many fights with my friends on the left. You know, I mean, you know, in 1968, when I was in Berkeley, you know, the epicenter of student radicalism, I was at a meeting where we were planning a July 4th demonstration against the war, and I got up there in front of all these Black Panthers, and you know, SDS at that point was out somewhere in Marxist-Leninist Maoist land, and I said, well, let's march with American flags, and I was the only one in the room. I mean, I was just whooshed out, boo, hiss, who the hell are you? You must be a narc or a fed or whatever, or worse, a liberal. It was so, that issue matters a great deal to me, somewhat differently in terms of Israel. I consider myself a defender of Israel and a lover of Israel, so that if anything I could be charged with, it may be that I expect more from my own than from others. I expect more from the United States than I do from other countries because it's the place where I can do something about it. And it's a country that, for better or worse, has a glorious set of values and expectations that make us special, and I hold us to it. There's a reason why at Tiananmen Square, you know, they simulate the Statue of Liberty. There's a reason why whenever people rebel in the world, they evoke Thomas Jefferson, who is a slave owner and all the rest of that stuff. But it's like with parents. He's also this inspirational figure. It's more than one thing in that regard. And I think the case of Israel is the same thing. Yes, the American Jewish community as a whole is the only white group in America that votes for black candidates. There's not a single other white group in America that will consistently vote for blacks when they run for office, historically. Despite all predictions that Jews were moving to the right and going to be neocon conservatives, they still vote next to blacks more for Democrats, more for liberals than any other ethnic group in the United States. The case. On the other hand, I think there is an oppressive, organized effort to minimize conversation and dissent on the issue of Israel in the organized Jewish community. I think it is made very, very clear to people that if they cross certain lines, they are at risk in a variety of ways. And I think the Holocaust educational community is part of that. And that worries me because I think it puts at risk many, many of the very, very good things we all do. And I don't want to underestimate the good things at all. They are invaluable. I certainly don't share, you know, I would never call Israel a fascist country or the kind of language that we'll hear sometimes from, you know, from other folks. I don't want to be put in the situation of, because Israel is doing something bad, that therefore everything the Palestinians and the defenders are doing is right. I mean, you want me to talk about Arafat for a while? You know, I mean, he's not my ideal of a figure. And the issue is very difficult to work through. But I think these forces are preventing a solution. I think they're preventing a solution. I think, just to be blunt about it, I think it's almost impossible for a candidate in the Democratic Party to take an honest, useful position on the solution in the Middle East because of their concern precisely about the Israel lobby that Mearsheimer and Walt talk about. Now, Mearsheimer and Walt are not completely right. They also exaggerate. Oil money, there's lots of lobbies in the United States, and there's nothing wrong with having lobbies. So they exaggerate because it's been so often off the table, you know, as a source of conversation. And I worry about, you know, kind of the Pat Buchanan forms of populist anti-Semitism that are out there, that this can feed into.
You back, though,
Yeah.
I feel like you're off the
Okay.
track here. Can you go back to how Holocaust education is?
Well, we've had this conversation.
Okay,
Bluntly,
sorry, I know there's others who want to speak, but I.
10 years, we don't talk about Palestinian issues except from one perspective. I think that is the record. Yeah.
You mentioned that it is possible that in the United States the support for Holocaust education is so strong because it's in a way the easy way out. It doesn't involve as much engagement and personal reflection as looking at things that happen in our own history. And I agree with that. But I just have a question. I find it very puzzling. You mentioned Dan Baron, our good friend, and Dan has this construct of a monolithic identity, where we are reluctant to look at ourselves until the evidence to the contrary becomes so overwhelming that we have to do something about it. And then that works beautifully. It worked for the Germans. It certainly worked for the Austrians. That's my line of inquiry, where, something like Kurt Waldheim in the 1980s coming on the scene, there was the catalyst. We had to look at ourselves. That image we had constructed just no longer was no longer tenable. But in the United States, why is it that we are not further when looking at issues such as the genocide of the Native Americans? We have looked at the evidence for a long, long time. There is no more monolithic charade on that when we know what happened. But still, not that much is done about it. Do you see that changing? And will there ever be a catalyst, something like a Waldheim in Austria, where that will bring this to the forefront that it deserves?
I don't know. I'm hoping that the changing demographics forces some questions as we become less of a nation of Christians and less of a nation of people of European descent, which is the direction we're moving. And I have no guarantees about that. I honestly, I'm fairly skeptical. I think the capacity of people to fool themselves is often greater than their capacity to face truths. I think the stuff we work on and fight on is lifetime, and we lose more than we win. And right now, I'm terrified that we're going to go into Iran, and I feel helpless and frustrated, and I worry about the links precisely in terms of the issues that I've been raising. I think people are easily prone to tribalism. I mean, front page in the New York Times talked about the Democrats taking a hike on protecting our civil liberties in terms of legislation. dealing, Patriot Act related legislation because they're afraid that the Republicans can use it in the election. Those kinds of situations, the PIN situation, that ability to ring that tribal bell, and of course there's and let's be also clear that the discourse in Israel is infinitely healthier, more vibrant. It's much easier to criticize Israeli policy in Israel than it is in the American Jewish community.
I like
Israelis are just, it's the classic, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I mean, taxi cab drivers yelling and screaming, and everybody argues all the time.
Not just the American Jewish community, but the American Christian community.
Even
you mentioned Democrats.
Yeah.
Then you look at the other radical side. I think they're probably more pro-Israel than the Jews.
And I don't think so.
Yeah.
You mean in the American Christian community?
I'm talking
Fundamental-
the
not
right-wing
the
fundamentalist
Christian.
Yeah,
that's
fundamentalist
That's
community.
different,
Yeah.
different
Absolutely.
than the American
Um,
Catholic.
I think we're at a moment where we don't know where we're going. I just finished a book on conservatism. I'm happy with what I have out. I think it may contribute to some of the conversation. I think conservatism is in a crisis. That's going to work to the benefit of Democrats and liberals. But I don't think Democrats and liberals necessarily have a vision or a strategy that will sustain them in power comparable to, let's say, the New Deal coalition. They have an opportunity because, honestly, this is the most incompetent administration in my lifetime. I mean, their ability to misstep is unbelievable. I mean, particularly since the 2004 election. I mean, from privatizing Social Security to Shivo to the S-chip issue going on presently, and you run into real problems when you don't believe in science and you don't believe in experts, and it eventually kicks you in the ass.
What's that got to do with genocide and transfer?
Probably nothing.
Just checking. I thought I might have missed.
No. That was my editorial lesson.
Can I ask you a question about that issue of if you teach genocide? I struggle with this. You teach an event, a genocide, not the Holocaust specifically. So I teach a lot of human rights, and I use genocide as examples or whatever. It's more than examples, but teaching events to demonstrate the need to get people interested in social justice issues and human rights, which aren't automatically genocide, crimes against humanity, etc. But then there's another part of the genocide teaching that seems to me has to do with nothing more than, not to demean, pure witness. In other words, I'm telling you what happened. I'm doing my best in the scholarship mode to find out what happened and to present it in the most honest way possible, for no other reason than just a witness, no agenda.
Okay.
And I wonder whether there's other reasons other than those two that come to mind for you.
Now let me see. I want to get to Karen's question for a second, but let me just. I don't know if I'm responding to what you want. I always worry about playing into students' fatalism. You can't do anything, can't change anything. I work hard not to do that, and on that basis, just telling them what happened is almost never sufficient, partly because of their questions and their comments. So I don't have a bleak view of the historical process in the sense that, I mean, I've grown up and seen the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern European communism, a tremendous liberation I never anticipated. Doesn't mean what's replaced it is wonderful, but it's better than what was. I grew up with segregated facilities in the United States. Astounding what African American community has been able to accomplish and what this society has made available with all the downsides since then, in terms of the creation of black middle class and black empowerment. And the reality, I mean, people joke about it, but I really believe Colin Powell would have been elected president if he had run. And I think if I can, well, let me not stretch on that. I also grew up with South African apartheid as permanent, as far as I could tell. And the thrill when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, I have very clear memories of listening on the radio and just having goosebumps all over and thinking, this is just the most wonderful thing. Freud one point argued that that truth, is like a beam of light, and you can marginalize it, but the arc of the truth tends to expand. And King had a metaphor he used about the arc of justice, I think. I think it's used in the Civil Rights Museum in Alabama, in Montgomery. So I try to indicate to students that history plays funny tricks on people, and sometimes the tricks are down tricks, negative tricks, but sometimes the tricks are that people rise to occasions and open that arc of enlightenment and liberty and democracy. And the scorecard in the world is a mixed scorecard. We've had some great victories in my lifetime. We've had some disappointments and losses. I would say on the whole, the direction to me is actually positive. When you think of Asia, for example, which has nothing to do with liberty and democracy in some ways, but it has to do with eating and nutrition and longevity, that 40% of the world population, that when I was a kid, my mom would say, eat, the people starving in China. The transformation going on in that part of the world is just, my son's living there. My son moved to China. I email with him and we talk about what's it like in Guangzhou and the idea that he's in that environment and the changes going on in the environment. So I don't tend to be a half-empty person. I tend to be a half-full person, but I can't be half-full unless I deal with what I see as the realities. You're giving me that signal.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay.
And
Okay,
still
but Karen wanted to
there's
ask something.
no
Please.
way. It'll take me 2 minutes to ask the question.
Well, why don't you ask the
Ask it
question?
and then we'll
Okay,
talk
here we
about
go.
it after.
I just want, going back to like teaching the Holocaust and
Yeah.
genocides, et cetera, just wanted to comment on this perhaps if you've seen it. I teach in high school. And one of the more difficult things I have been challenged with over the course of the last 5 years of teaching about the Holocaust and genocides is, of course, we learn about, starts with some stereotypes, dehumanization, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have taught through tolerance over the last decade or so is you can't say that in front of this group, whatever. And what I have seen instead, which is perhaps even more of a barrier to try to break, is that the group within itself, it's okay to do. Okay, in other words, the Jewish kids can use the Jewish stereotypes with each other.
Yeah,
They dehumanize each
That's
other
right.
according to those stereotypes.
Right.
But you can't do it from outside in. Same thing with African Americans, same thing with Chicanos.
Right.
And so now, it's like, to try to break that barrier, I'm looked at as an outsider. You can't tell us what to do because this is our group, and this is what we can say to each other. You don't understand this.
Quick,
Have you had
first,
this process?
congratulations. You just got your master's, right?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Latest person to get the master's. As a teacher, pedagogically, what I find is there has to be time in the classroom before I can do that. That when I walk in the room, let's say when I teach an ethnic minority relations class and I'm the white guy up there, the old white guy up there, and I have a class of 40% African American, 20% Latino and white, I begin with mistrust. In fact, I legitimate their mistrust at the beginning. I talk about their reasons for mistrusting me, and I basically say, don't trust me, no reason to trust me. What I try to do is over the first month or so, behave in such a way that they begin to see some possibility of trusting, and as we move along in the semester, I can take more risks precisely along the lines you're indicating. I can talk about acting black. Okay, I can talk about Puerto Rican kids and their views of Dominicans. I couldn't do that the first week. But if I'm effective in the classroom by the middle or the end of the classroom, if we've, you know what happens, in all your classes is a point, if it works, where they're on your side, where you've somehow gotten across. It just happens. It doesn't happen the first week. Once that happens, I find I can address these issues. And here's the kicker in the last line, students handle it better than my colleagues.
Well, I think that's a very good, controversial.
Thank you, guys.
I want to thank Professor Lyons for what was obviously a very stimulating, exciting presentation. Thank you, Paul. And I would like to invite you to come back in another month when Professor Michael Hayes will dazzle us with his presentation
He had a much better
on
title.
Carcasses of Memory,
Oh.
Ruins as Memorials
I was
to
envious
Wartime
for that title,
Destruction
Michael.
and Persecution in Germany. So again, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you on November the 8th.
Yeah.